Thanks so much, Jim. I'm really happy to be here and excited to share this work. The work that I'm presenting today, I'm going to call Prosper Geo, and I'm going to pitch it as a way to study friendship networks, community context, and adolescent health. One thing that's a little bit different is that this is a newer project, and so I don't have results yet. But that also means that I am very open to suggestions and feedback about this project. So to begin, I study adolescent problem and health behavior. The majority of my work is on adolescent drug and alcohol use, but I also study related health behaviors like delinquency and depressive symptoms. I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room that social networks seem to matter for understanding these behaviors. Individuals influence each other's health behaviors through a variety of mechanisms, and these behaviors also play a role in shaping the networks. They help to determine who is friends with whom. Similarly, we also know that community context matters for problem and health behaviors. The traditional focus of the neighborhood effects literature was on the structural characteristics of neighborhoods, looking at things like poverty and residential mobility and how they seem to predict different health outcomes. And that literature has now developed a little bit, and so it retains that focus, but it's also considered other things. So for example, institutional resources seem to matter. Different neighborhood and community institutions also seem to matter in terms of shaping behavior. So I'm going to argue that if we want to understand adolescent problem and health behaviors, that we need to consider both friendship networks and community context. And that's being driven by two observations. And so the first observation is pretty obvious and probably not especially interesting. It's that if we know that friendship networks matter, and if we know that community context matters, then we need to consider both in order to pursue this full understanding of social determinants of health. But the other observation that is a little less obvious, maybe a little underappreciated, and probably more important, is that the community context literature often very explicitly recognizes those networks as the reason that communities matter. So if we think back to the traditional work on social disorganization theory, there's this observation that neighborhoods that had higher levels of poverty and more residential mobility had higher crime rates. But the argument wasn't that the people who lived there just had like something inherently wrong with them. Instead, it was the argument that like, hey, in these neighborhoods, the individuals are less able to supervise teenage peer groups. And those teenage peer groups are engaging in delinquency, and that's what's causing crime. Or if we look at some of the health literature, it says that neighborhood institutions matter. They shape norms, they shape values, they provide social control. But we know that adolescents spend a lot of time in peer groups as they exit childhood, which means that those neighborhood institutions and resources, they should matter for the entire group, not just for individuals. Right. So I'm not the first person who's noticed this. I don't think it's particularly controversial. And yet, if we look at the existing research that explicitly links neighborhoods and friendships, that existing research is pretty modest. And I think the simplest explanation for why that research tends to be fairly modest is simply that a lot of the data that we have is really well suited for capturing either neighborhood effects or friendship network effects, and it's not always ideal for capturing the interplay between them. And so as just like a little bit of exercise to think about like, well, how do I study friendship network dynamics, and are those data then a good way to study neighborhood effects? So if you're someone like myself and you're saying like, okay, well, I want to study adolescent drug and alcohol use, I want to study adolescent friendship networks, how do you do that? I would say, well, you know, most drug and alcohol use isn't going to come to the attention of parents or teachers or law enforcement or public health officials. You know, but if we ask students, they will tell us. So we'll just use self-report. Same way with collecting information about their friendships. We'll just ask them who their friends are. Well, if we're interested in community processes, self-reports become a little bit more problematic. They probably do matter for things like community safety, but if we're interested in community measures of, say, residential stability, or we want to know counts of resources that are in the communities, a teenager's reports of those might not be the most reliable measures. If we think about how do we select a sample, if you're someone like me who's interested in peer influence, then you're interested in things like bidirectional influence. You're interested in indirect influence. You're interested in clustering. You're interested in group positions. And because of all these things, there is a strong emphasis on trying to collect either a complete or semi-complete network. So someone like myself would say, oh, well, why don't we just go and collect information from all the students in a school? Well, if you're doing community research, that means that maybe you have now limited variability on those community mechanisms because you have students from similar communities going into the same school. It also means that if you only have one school, although maybe that's a semi-complete population of students, it also means that you no longer have the ability to use school-based measures as a proxy for neighborhoods. So if you were doing like a national sample, you could look at things like, oh, what percentage of students are eligible for free and reduced price school lunch as a proxy of kind of neighborhood conditions. But if everyone's from the same school, you no longer have variability on that measure. Finally, frequency of data collection. We know that during adolescence, friendships change somewhat regularly. We know that the onset and change in adolescent problem and health behaviors happens pretty quickly. It means that people like myself love to collect data at least every year, preferably semi-annually. If you're studying communities, that might not be a great way to devote your resources. Communities can and do change. But one of the insights from the Chicago school is that, like, well, a lot of these community measures are remarkably stable over time. So if you don't have a reason to think that they're changing, semi-annual data collection on community measures, right, may not be a great use of resources. All right. So the project that I'm talking about today is really motivated by two separate research questions. The first research question is, how do we obtain data that allow us to link network and neighborhood processes? This sounds like it's a pretty big, tough question, but it's not. In fact, it is remarkably easy. And that's not because I'm super smart. It's because so many smart people have done so much great research on networks and neighborhoods that identifying best practices is pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, answering this question leads me to my next question, which is, how do we obtain data that allow us to link network and neighborhood processes for like less than $50 million? So we've had some great speakers this week, and they've talked about a bunch of different topics, and yet this theme of the cost of data collection keeps on coming up, right? Like Ashton talked about respondent-driven sampling, and one of the reasons that you should consider doing it is because of the cost of data collection through traditional methods. There's the talk about weird data collection. Again, in that situation, it's like, well, why do we do that? It's like, well, if we don't have the money or the funds to do other types of data collection. Bob, whenever he was talking about his data, similarly, he talked about using older data. He talked about not spending money on social media recruitment and consultants. Carol mentioned it today, right? So like just the costs that come with collecting data. So if we want to pursue best standards for network and neighborhood data, aside, if anyone has like $50 million, I have great ideas. But how do we do this for less than that? All right. So Prosper Geo is a project that I am leading with Sarah Chalinsky and Mark Feinberg, both from Penn State. And this is a project that is going to build on the available evaluation data of the Prosper prevention trial. I'm assuming that a lot of people here have been exposed to this data in one way or another. The Prosper prevention trial is going to be the system of community-supported intervention programs that was designed to reduce adolescent risky behaviors. The program was implemented in 28 communities in Iowa and Pennsylvania. Half of these communities received the program, and half of them served as control groups. We should note that these communities are certainly not nationally representative. They are non-metropolitan. They're predominantly white and English speaking. 15% or more of the students had to be eligible for free or reduced price school lunch. So these are not affluent communities. Data collection from the students began in 2002, and it was collected from 2 consecutive cohorts of students. The first wave of data collection was in the fall when the students were in 6th grade, and then it occurred in the spring from 6th through 12th grade. Overall, we have data collected from more than 15,000 students and about 9,000 students per wave. So the students in these communities filled out questionnaires. They were approximately 8 pages. These are pretty standard questionnaires. They provide information about the demographic characteristics of students, information about the students' self-reported school performance, their attitudes towards schools, their relationships with their parents, how their parents actually parent them, and parenting styles. And there's also a number of measures that are related to problem and health behaviors. And so this is going to include drug and alcohol use, and includes measures of delinquency, depressive symptoms, and at the later waves, some measures of self-harm. One of the reasons that these data are so great for studying social networks is because on the last page of the questionnaire, we asked the students to name up to 2 of their best friends in their same school and grade, up to 5 other friends in their school and grade, and their most recent boyfriend or girlfriend. So this provides really rich social network data that cover almost the entirety of adolescence. I also want to mention, at least quickly, that in addition to these social network data, there are also measures asking the students to tell us how much time they spent hanging out with each of the friends that they named. And there was also the opportunity for them to tell us how many other friends they had who were either in other grades and in other schools. And if you look at the published work that uses the Prosper data, I think that these data have been underutilized a little bit, and I'm hoping to use them more in the future. All right, so these data have already been collected. They've already been used in a number of publications. And so Prosper Geo is about creating and adding new data to the existing data. And the way that we're going to do that is we are going to use geospatial data that is based on the student home addresses. One of the reasons that the response rates in Prosper are so high, the participation rates are so high, is that Prosper used a passive consent procedure. This meant that the consent forms were mailed to the student homes, and as a result, we have a database that has the last known addresses of these students. And so these are the addresses for the students while they were in these schools. And from this source of data, we are going to create a number of geospatial measures, distance matrices, counts of community establishments, and we're also going to attach census variables. Right. So first, one of the things that we're going to be doing is we are going to be calculating the geographic distance between the home addresses. If you're somebody who studies adolescent friendship networks like myself, you try to understand how and why students become friends. But one of the things that we often do is we act like the students are just like thrown into a school together, and they seek out people based on their attributes. And we kind of ignore the fact that, hey, like they actually have a life outside of school. Some of these students might live right next to each other. Some of them might live many miles away from one another. And so we're hoping to actually incorporate that into that friendship selection process understanding. Similarly, when we think about peer influence, we think about the different ways that they might influence one another. And one of the things that we haven't really considered or modeled very well is that, again, some of these students live next to each other, and we also have those measures of whether they spend time hanging out with one another. Right now, we are just using the Euclidean distance between the homes. We're also hoping to calculate the distance based on roads. Turns out that's a little more computationally intensive. The data are a little older, so it introduces some problems. But we're like cautiously optimistic that we can pursue that. Our information about community establishments and as they represent resources and risk factors in the community, this is going to come from the North American Industry Classification System, or the NAICS. And so the NAICS uses codes that are provided by the US Census, where every establishment is classified according to its primary purpose or business interest. And so we went through these codes and we are categorizing them into these subcategories. So for example, the subcategory for alcohol is going to include establishments that their primary purpose is as a bar, a lounge, a nightclub, or a retail establishment that they primarily sell alcohol. We are interested in both opportunity and access to these types of institutions. And so what we are going to be doing is calculating how many of each types of institutions are both within 1 mile of the student's home and how many of them are within 10 miles of the student's home. So for example, how many of these bars, restaurants, or not restaurants, bars, liquor stores, lounges are within 1 mile, how many are within 10 miles. Finally, we are going to use tract level census data. This is just a small example of some of the measures. This helps us get around that problem where within one school, everybody's in the same school, and so we think that they're coming from the same community. We recognize that in these non-metropolitan communities, there's actually a lot of variation when you look at things like population density and household income. And so even for students who are attending the same school, we are going to be able to look at their particular census tract of where they live. All right, current status and next steps. So I'm happy to say that we have some pilot funding. And the purpose of obtaining the pilot funding was to get an initial sense of the data quality and the feasibility of this project. It's going pretty well. Of the students who provided usable friendship network data, we have been able to geocode approximately over 80% of their home addresses. So the data quality appears to be pretty reasonable, certainly not perfect, but not too bad. And what we are currently working on is showing that we are able to incorporate this information into our existing social network models. And so one of the things that we'll be doing is incorporating, for example, distance matrices into exponential random graph models and the Siena stochastic actor-based models. Future funding, hey, we've had some changes recently. We're in a situation, along with others, where we are kind of reevaluating and trying to figure out next best steps. All right. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions, but also suggestions as we continue working on this project. Yeah.
I'm gonna probably ask almost the same question that I asked earlier, but I was very locked into the portion about the community as the school context, but I'm also probably going to ask your opinions on like social media and how that's especially bridging this gap between kids who are geographically very distant from each other, and how you sort of think that those friends who may not actually be like literally in the same geographical space as, for example, one of the participants, how that influence might play out, especially online, if you think it's important to consider. Or
yeah, no, that's a great question. I think everyone who is doing research on adolescent friendships is dealing with that question right now. Like, we all know it matters. How much does it matter? How do you measure it? The first wave of data collection here started in the year 2002, which is really interesting because in terms of like the adoption of internet and cell phones, it's really like when a lot of that stuff took off. So on one hand, I would suspect that the impact in these data are probably a little bit less than the effect that you would see on data today. This is also where it's like, hey, if someone has $50 million, like that needs to be considered in new data, right? It's something that, with existing kind of like older data, it's like you know what matters, but you're hoping it doesn't matter too much. I think that for like future ongoing projects, we really need to have measures of that in some way to account for it. Yeah.
I think it's super fascinating. I think from my problem with neighborhood research,
Yeah.
like how does this influence neighborhood?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So I guess like, what is that compromise between like maybe living distances versus like a highly rural area? A census tract population-based metric is not an aerial thing here.
Right. Yes, very much. So for those of you who have know about the neighborhood research, right? There's this ongoing debate and discussion about like what is a neighborhood? How do you measure a neighborhood? And so I kind of have two answers to that. The first one is that using the census tract, I think, is a good first step, and that's why we're doing it. Those data are readily available. They are easily integrated. They provide better information than just aggregating at the school. So that's a good thing. The second part is like, oh, but could we do better than that? And that's one of the things that we're still thinking about and kind of debating. And there again, there's a couple of issues, right? So one is like, well, how do you do that? And then the second issue there is, well, how much of an improvement do you get and at what cost? And this is, again, I go back to the $50 million. It's like, man, like I'd love to go to neighborhoods and actually collect information and do something like the PHDCN, where you have this incredibly rich information that isn't just bounded by a census tract. Yeah, I can say both. I would love to do it. I still think that this is a good kind of first approximation to see what's going on. All right, Carter?
Yeah, so I'm like one of the most biggest fans of the networking media. I probably agree with it. So I love what people want to add to this stuff. We know that's the most powerful covariate there is, and there's nobody likes that. That's true. Right?
Yeah.
So, but so one thing you were worrying about that is the road isn't particularly distance. So, I mean, it's nice that you can have it, but here's a dark secret. Everybody who starts doing some kind of geographical thing at the beginning says, oh my gosh, we really need to travel distance, travel time. That's the right thing. Trying to do, which shouldn't be Euclidean, but of course, distance on the geosphere is terrible. But then you break yourself to calculate them, and then you discover they correlate at 0.9999999. It never matters, right? I mean, and then of course that asterisk to asterisk will never, right? You can find special cases, but usually, unless it's a tiny scale, you're not going to care that much. So I think that just getting the baseline is more important. Now, dealing with uncertainty in that data is going to be important because that you said you got 80-some% of good. Well, that's good. Of course, then the other ones you're probably going to be able to bound that only to a polygon or something.
Yeah.
And so there's
Right.
some stuff or imputation that improves that. But getting that is important. But here's the other thing I wanted to suggest to think about. A big downfall of a lot of historical data people did try to do this type of data collection. And it's very frustrating to make their data very hard to use later is they collected data on the locations of ego and alter, or often just the distance between ego and alter. But they do not have data on the distance between ego and non-alter. So I don't know who the available alters are, and I don't know how far away they are. If I do not know the distribution of possible people that you weren't tied to and how far away they are, the utility of distance data goes to approximately 0. Because we need to know, we want to know how distance is related to say whether we're tied to somebody or we're interacting with them. We have to know about alternatives who we could have been tied to and how far they were. And so for that, you need population distribution. Now, I don't know, I mean, in this series, people are in an absolute sense, and that can help, but I don't know also how your de-identification works with that, how much of that's thrown away. So you may have to think about what you're allowed to divulge or collect or whatever with it. But I would suggest that whatever you're doing, think about how you're getting metrics of distances to people who are not, who the people our egos are not tied to. Because that's actually kind of the hardest part and kind of the most important part of using the data. And it gets just, you look at the historical literature going back to the 40s, it gets over 90-something% of the time.
Yeah. Thank you. And I should clarify that the distance matrix is the distance between everybody in that school and grade, regardless of whether they're friends. So it's like we have two matrices, right? The friendship matrix and then the...
You do it for everyone.
Right, we're doing it for everyone, right? So if... but not about non-school people, not about people in other grades. So that is, the Prosper data are contained to that same school and same grade. But the good news is that everybody in there that we have the data for, even if they're not friends, it's like that, we're still able to account for that. Yes? Yeah.
Something that I never planned this, to think about and making a lot of about distance versus where But,
Yeah. Yeah, I'd actually like to cite you. I'll be like, Carter says it doesn't matter. That's.
Waldo's Tumblr.
Yeah.
He's been everything you've ever known at distance. Waldo did it at some point.
Yeah.
And buried it somewhere in some secret place.
I'm actually kind of, I mean, I guess I put it back a little bit. I'm wondering if you have data about how people get around. Because I know these are don't those cars.
No, we don't have that type of data. No, the data that I have are very much, at least at this point, unless there's other data that I haven't thought about, which I'm certainly open to suggestions. It is those survey data, including the friendship network data, and then the new data are going to be the related to the geospatial data, which it's essentially anything that we can calculate using the geo coordinates of their home addresses.
I guess I'm curious if you are thinking about whether or not the average living distance is vary essentially when people turn 16. Since you have that difference between 6th grade and 12th grade, of the fact that like if you cannot control your own transportation and people live far away from you, then you are reliant on your parents, older siblings, someone else to take you to said location.
Yeah, absolutely. So my previous work and the stuff that I'm kind of finishing up is very much about developmental change in drug and alcohol use and how much and why peers matter at different ages and how it shifts over time. And so, you know, obviously one of the things that we want to look at is similar to this, because we would very much expect that the distance matters a lot more, like when you're in 6th grade and it's like, oh, hey, you know, these are your friends because you can walk to their house. Versus maybe by the time you're a junior or senior in high school, people have transportation in these communities, and then you would think that perhaps distance matters less because they have the ability to get there. Uh-huh.
And she talks to her peers, like they play Minecraft together.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like that's the whole concept of distance, like it's thrown out the window.
Yeah.
She talks to her cousin that lives in Utah, and they play Minecraft together with Facebook. So like that brings like that concept of co-presence that we use with immigrants that migrate and like people when they are abroad, like to the likes of like it becomes like something that is relevant as like to the population because they independent of like being able to actually physically go and see their friends, like they have like this new way that they can.
Yeah, I mean, that follows up exactly on the comment previously about, you know, how social media and stuff matters. One thing I will say, though, is that, I mean, it's nice that we have that measure, and that's why I mentioned about this hanging out, the spending time together, because we know that a lot of adolescent behavior, and especially like adolescent problem behavior, it's group behavior. A lot of when we look at things like drinking and smoking and marijuana use, this is stuff that's happening in groups. And so I definitely think that those kind of like online and farther distance relationships matter. But I also think it's possible that like actually being in contact with people in those groups is going to be especially important for those behaviors.
I think they have said this, but I didn't take into account the environment of one of the alters.
Yes. So for everyone who is the data are collected, if we put aside the friendship network for a moment, everyone who is in those school grade cohorts, like we have their address and we are able to create the geocodes. And so we are able to create those measures for everybody who are in the data. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm just curious whether, it could be that you would add a model that could influence.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but thank you. I will definitely look into it. Yeah.
Yeah, so we did a paper a while back, the neighborhood characteristics with the co-offending.
Uh-huh.
And the argument being that some neighborhoods are more conducive to
Yeah, I think we can, for sure, because I think that's one of, like, when you look at the literature and like why this stuff matters, right? You know, what are the opportunities to do things? And that's why looking at those measures, I should actually go back to it, because I kind of went through this quickly. Especially this is something that we're really interested in, right? So about, you know, are there police nearby? Are there police station? Are there these schools nearby? Are there places where kids can hang out? Are there retail establishments that sell tobacco and alcohol? The research suggests that this matters for these groups. And again, the research that has actually been able to test these mechanisms, it exists, but it's pretty modest. So we're hoping to do that.
All right, last question, and then we're going to get lunches here.
I'm wondering if, so this is like a big issue in urban areas. I don't know how much in rural areas. Do you have any kind of idea of the margin of error related to like people who are lying about where they live in order to decide?
Oh, yeah. That is a good question. We have, again, it's from the files for the passive consent process. So it is whatever address they provided with the school. So if they are lying, we wouldn't know. I will say that one of the nice things about the Prosper data and using these types of schools is that in these communities, like, there is only one high school. So one of the nice things is, like, you know, it's unfortunate that it doesn't capture out of school friends, but it's also true that in these communities, like, the number of other schools, it's not zero. There are some private schools here and there. There's, you know, kids who are homeschooled, but like, there really is just one high school, and that's going to capture most of the students who are in that school and grade. It's this, yeah. I spoke to someone from New York once, and it's like, you know, the relationship between you know, where you live and where you go to school is like sometimes meaningless. That is not the case here, right? Like, if you were in one of these moderately to small towns, you go to this school in most cases. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan.